Welcome to the Ideas Hour with your hosts David Cameron and Suzanne Zeedyk, exploring big ideas that matter. This series was originally broadcast on Teacher Hug Radio in 2021 and 2022. It is still available in their archive as well as in this format.
Today is going to be a real justification for our program title. It will be the Ideas Hour, because we're going to be discussing a book which doesn't even have a title yet. It might be called About Our Schools, or Schooling in England, Where Next? It might even be called Our Passion for Schools, but what it certainly is bursting with big ideas. There are 6 big and challenging ideas and 39 steps to achieving them. So today will be a real adventure.
And to help us in that adventure, we've got 2 of the most commanding figures in education over the last 50 years. Although if this wasn't in radio and you could actually see them, you would think it had been much, much longer. But both of them have been a huge influence in me. Both of them have been a huge help to me in my career and the career that I've built latterly. For me, they're both relentlessly curious. Suzanne talks in other contexts about fierce curiosity, and few people demonstrate that better than Tim Brighouse and Mick Waters. And they're not only relentlessly curious, they're tirelessly humane. And for me, both of them, massive forces for good in the world, particularly in the world of education.
Wonderful. So, Tim, Mick, welcome to the Ideas Hour. I've already said that your book has what you describe as 6 foundation stones. But could we start with, is there a big idea or a big principle that underlines all of them? What would be the key idea that you would want our listeners today to take away? Tim, would you like to kick us off?
Well, if it were me answering, but you'll find that Mick answers in a totally different way. It's one of the pleasures of writing a book with somebody. But if I were answering that, I'd say, well, we think, first of all, that it's the teachers who make the weather. There's a wonderful quote by Zeedyk, which says, I've come to the frightening conclusion that it's what I do in the classroom every day that makes the difference. I can humor or humiliate. I make the weather and I set the climate. So the teacher makes the most difference. And we think that other people can affect the likelihood of the teacher making good weather. So we hope teachers will certainly look at this book, but we hope that those people who presume to affect what the teachers do, whether that's a head teacher or whether it's people beyond that in a local authority in England or in a multi-academy trust in England, or to be a local authority in Scotland, or the government, that they will have a look at the book too, because we think that they are trying to influence the weather, and not always for the best, at least south of the border. So that's our first big idea. And the second idea, which ought to attract people to it, is that it's written about ages in education. We start in 1976 because our then Prime Minister, James Callaghan, it gave a thing called the Ruskin speech. And that signaled the end of an age after the war of optimism and trust, at least again south of the border, less so north of the border. You've always properly been wary of what the English are getting up to. And south of the border, we became preoccupied with markets. And markets inevitably lead to success, but also some failure. And so you get centralization as people interfere at central government level to stop the failure, and managerialism because they interfere to a huge extent. So we think we're absolutely on the edge of a new age, and I can't remember what that age is, but my good friend Mick will know exactly what the third age is going to be.
Well, we think the next age is one of hope, ambition and collaborative partnerships. We think there's a pent-up desire in the English system for people to join together and work together on an age where we're looking to the future and looking forward more productively than we have in the past. Our book has explored the thoughts and feelings of people involved in education over that period that Tim talked about. So we've talked with secretaries of state, and we began with them, asking them what they might have done differently, what they were proud of, what they thought they achieved. And after that, we spent time with significant people in the education system in England, for everybody from chief inspectors through to people who have done jobs on the edge of education, if you like, people in charities and children's commissioners and people like that, but also head teachers and people who run multi-academy trusts or local authorities. And from that, we gleaned from 100 and odd conversations, thoughts of people who want to move forward. And most people have made massive contribution, but they also realise there have been failings as well as successes, and they want to take things on for the future. So our book sort of explores through the 6 foundation stones and the 39 steps, the possibilities that are there in the future as we move forward.
I'm absolutely fascinated in a sense, because I've talked about the Juno quote as well, which I shamelessly stole from Tim. But I've moved on, and it's, who makes the weather? And then the second question for me is, who creates the climate? And the third question is, who keeps sending in the sodding hurricanes? And whose job is it to do something about that? And I've got caught up in this idea of the role of school leadership and the middle tier, if you like, as being to build the shelter belt. So that is that why these ideas matter so much, and matter so much particularly now? Is it about really getting that transition that allows the best that we're capable of to be enacted in the classroom?
Well, our feeling is that, it's the teachers who make the difference in the end. They're the closest to the youngster, and they make the real impact on their lives. But all those people who surround the teachers, the head teachers, and what's often called the middle tier, affect the way they work. And our belief is that teachers need to be expressing themselves yet stronger. They need to be more professional, more confident, more able to influence the system. And one of our pleas in the way we've structured the book is for the notion of what's often called subsidiarity to be really grasped. That notion that decisions are made nearest to where they affect the outcome, and that we ask people who are working closely with the teachers to exert more influence on the system. And in a sense, those that are in the middle tier or are often thought of as in the upper tier back off a bit to allow that to happen. And in England, what we've noticed over the last many years in terms of centralisation is that the middle and the upper tiers, as they're often called, are grabbing the agenda and manipulating the agenda for good reason, but often making mistakes, and leaving the teaching profession to deal with the upshot of what they've created.
Could I come in there and ask, I know, Tim, you're going to come in next. What do you think people will do with these ideas in terms of day-to-day work? So in other words, they're lovely big ideas that you have. What day-to-day difference do you think it will make to the way teachers operate in the classroom?
The problem in answering that question is that there will be quite a difference between Scotland and England. In England, the culture is very confined. So there's been a pressure towards identikit kind of teachers who know what a lesson plan is, do the lesson plan, are told what ought to be in the lesson, and are told it down to the last detail. And so what we're doing in our book is removing the likelihood of the system making that happen to the teacher, and secondly, speculating about what teachers do in classrooms that make a difference. I mean, down to the level of, or if you like, up from the level of, if you've made some mistakes, Suzanne, and I'm a bad teacher, I say, Suzanne, another 5 mistakes. I mean, take that work away and improve on it. What on earth are you doing? Whereas the good teacher will say, 5 mistakes, and I'm wonderful. Here are 5 opportunities to learn. In other words, they make the weather by very small interventions. And we hope that we have tackled some of those small interventions, as well as the bigger switches that need to be turned so that teachers have a better chance of doing their job.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is absolutely fascinating in that sense, because I think what we're talking about here is back to one of your central ideas, Tim, about the butterfly effect, about the small actions that produce great impacts, and aligning that with the need for permission, if you like, that whole idea of giving teachers the agency to make the decisions in their classroom about the steps that they need to take. And that alliance, if you like, between teacher agency and permissive and enabling leadership and management seems to me to be absolutely central to an awful lot of what I imagine is going to be in the book. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, it is a fair comment. And when we talked about butterflies, we're looking at low effort, high impact interventions. And we've also played around with what I would call WASPs, David, which are big impact but low effort interventions that don't have a good effect. And we're obviously not going to dwell too much on those. We'll be aiming at kind of a good balance between appreciative inquiry and problem solving, and certainly trying to avoid enforcing compliance. And it seems those 3 approaches to education, on the whole, governments try and enforce compliance, and teachers, good teachers, get a balance of appreciative inquiry and solving my problems and helping me to do that so I become a really empowered learner, is what they're up to. So they could do with a bit less of enforcing compliance and a bit more of trust and support.
I think it's important to know that in England, there's a sort of growing envy of the way in which teachers in Wales and in Scotland are engaged in the process of thinking about where education and schooling goes. And that the notion of the butterflies is within the context of a permitting set of circumstances that allow teachers to take things forward in their professional sense. So when teachers in England look at what's happening in Scotland or in Wales, and they see moves forward which embrace their thinking, which encourage them to have views and encourage them to have a contribution to make, in England there's a sort of realization that that's not been happening to us, and that's why we think a new age is really vital. And it's not a case of just doing anything that counts and anything that might count or giving it a go. It's a really thoughtful process of working out what teachers generally and individually can do to make a difference to the schooling system that they inhabit and want to make a difference to.
Mick, you've just said that teachers in England feel a bit jealous of teachers in Wales and Scotland. Does it feel like you've said something radical and controversial there to say that out loud? So in other words, has it taken courage to say this out loud, or does it feel obvious?
For me, it feels very, very obvious. And I think those teachers in England that know what's happening in those 2 countries are starting to look across the borders and thinking, what's different between us and them? Why is this happening there? And the realization that actually in England, centralization, which has led to marketization and led to managerialism, those three things have taken root in England and are in some ways constraining the system rather than allowing it to unfold in a way that might be more imaginative and more suited to the way the world is going for the future and for the way youngsters need to develop. Over the years, we've done better in England for a particular group of children. We do far better for many children than we ever did. But actually, there's always been a worry about youngsters who were ill-served by the system, and currently there's a worry about what's often called the forgotten third. And there's a sort of tension in the system. We know we're achieving more for some children, but we're worried about what we're not achieving for others. And I think people are looking to other systems. I've mentioned Wales and Scotland, but we look to other systems around the globe and we think, what is it that they're doing that we could not imitate, but learn from and grow from? And how do we create a profession that looks globally, thinks globally, and acts for the future in our children? So no, I don't think it's brave. I think it's pretty obvious, actually.
Tim, you might want to add to that, because we were both involved in an event a few years back where we tried to bring together people from the 4 countries of the United Kingdom to talk about what we had in common, what the differences were. And I think there was an overall sense there that we don't learn enough from one another.
No, and by the way, it was pretty obvious, David, that when we interviewed our secretaries of state, well, if any of them had visited Scotland, and we introduced Scotland to the conversation once or twice, they weren't letting on. I mean, they visited for all the obvious reasons of having a good holiday and for cultural and other reasons, but they hadn't kind of analysed the differences between the Scottish system and ours. And one thing that and I know this will be a thorny issue north of the border as well as it is south of the border, but one of the issues we raised with them was the question of permanent exclusions and fixed term exclusions of children, because we know the likelihood of a full-time permanent exclusion causing trouble to that individual and to society later. In 2018, we put to our witnesses that in England, which has a population of about 47 million, 7,852 children were permanently excluded. And then we put to them that in Scotland, which is conveniently about 1/10 of the size of England, I mean, how many did they think would be excluded? I mean, would it be 785? Well, no, it wasn't. And it wasn't 78, and it wasn't 7, it was 5. Now, I know you will say, well, it's not as perfect up here as you seem to think it is, and nowhere is perfect. But that is a marked difference. You are much less exclusive. Yet some of our witnesses, well, most of our witnesses, were unaware of that. And so when we measure the effectiveness of a schooling system, and we deal with this in the book, it isn't a question of simply attainment. It's a question of, well, we may do rather well, as Mick said, by the academic, but if we have a forgotten third, what's going to happen to their lives? And we've tried to suggest ways in which that could be improved.
And I think it's now time to take the big risk, because we've got some time restraints and all the rest of it. And I've heard you both before, but this is the opportunity for you to take us through your 6 big ideas, your 6 foundation stones. So over to you, and we'll do our best to make it fit the timings.
Well, I'll start off because Mick and I have agreed on this bit, which is the first of our 6 foundation stones is to try to tackle the huge power of the Secretary of State. When at the start of this period, the Secretary of State had 3 powers. Now the Secretary of State's got over 2,000. And incidentally, be on your guard north of the border that you don't allow too much centralisation, and you have much less of it than we do, but the temptation on governments is huge. So we suggest that there ought to be a schooling framework commission, which would use citizens' juries, would have all sorts of people on it that you would expect: teachers, teacher unions, different members of different political parties, the churches, the universities, CBI, all those sorts of people. And they would sit for a year and produce a kind of plan, which would be a 10-year plan. And they would do it for all the major parts of our system, of how it works, of assessment, etc., etc. And they would say, this is the plan for the next 10 years. And the Secretary of State, while still having power, would, if he or she wanted to change any bit of that plan, have to say they were going to change it. We think it should be chaired, that commission, and it should use citizens' frameworks and heaven knows all in the consultation for a year, which would go into producing the plan, should be chaired by the chair of the select committee. So it would be still in political hands, but it would take advice from everyone.
Tim, can you be explicit about why you don't want the Secretary of State to have so much power? Why don't you like it being in their hands?
Because I believe in devolution. I cannot believe that it's democratically or professionally right that one person in a country the size of 47 million should be deciding how to learn to read, how a teacher should teach reading, what should be in the curriculum and each syllabus. I don't think that's right, that is concentrated in the way it is at the moment without any reference to anybody else. They've got rid of all their advisory committees. They now have unbridled power to say what they want to say. And in my view, that is quite wrong. It's very undemocratic. And you can't get decisions given communication, you can't get decisions on matters such as reading so well defined at the centre that there is going to be any sense of support locally that's widespread. There will be a feeling of alienation.
I think it's really helpful to hear you say that, because many people will not realize that that's how the education system is being so shaped in England. So having a really explicit statement about that is, I think, helpful. Okay, so what's the second foundation stone?
Well, if the first one is the Framework Commission, our next four actually are all about children, and the final one is about teachers. But of course, all the ones about children are about teachers as well. Our second one is to do with the experiences of childhood and adolescence. And it sounds very simple, but we're suggesting that there should be a real rethink of what the curriculum should be for childhood and what the curriculum should be for adolescence. We play around in our book with the notion of adverse adolescent experiences. We've heard about adverse childhood experiences for a long while, but adverse adolescence experiences are similar experiences on top of the issue of adolescence, where children are trying to find their way from leaving childhood into adulthood without sort of feeling of being lost in between. And we've always known that's been a sort of great big ditch that children have had to go through. But over the last generations, that ditch is now full of massive brambles to do with things like social media and the upsurge in drugs and the upsurge in the challenges of youth, really. And our proposal is that we really rethink how the curriculum is formed. Typically in England, we start with what children will need for A-level and construct the curriculum backwards down to the age of 5. Early years tends to come up to meet it. And we're saying that the school is a universal provider for childhood, in that every child goes to school, nearly every child goes to school. And then around that needs to be other agencies that bring in consideration of social and health and civic understandings, employability understandings for children, and that the schooling system harmonizes that in a structured provision, rather than our, in England, very simplistic academic curriculum plus some add-ons called extra curriculum plus a few things you might do outside school if you're lucky. We're saying let's really rethink how a curriculum for childhood and one for more mature children, a curriculum for adolescents, could emerge, and how it could be a consensus view rather than simply constructing a curriculum that children travel along until they can't do it anymore and they basically fall off the edges. And that we wouldn't lose as many children if we really thought about how the curriculum should look. So that's our second foundation stone.
Mick, I think many people who are not involved in education may be a bit shocked maybe to hear that that is the way the curriculum is constructed, that we start from the content of A-levels and just work backwards, and that we really do not take the experiences of children as people into account, that we are teaching a curriculum rather than teaching children. And so saying it that clearly is helpful to people because it sounds a bit shocking.
Well, if you look at national curriculum in most parts of the world, and again, Scotland's tried to make progress, as has Wales and Northern Ireland, in terms of really thinking through the way a curriculum unfolds for children from early years onwards. In England, typically we start from what's expected for the qualification, and then we thread every child through the eye of a needle to get to it. And of course, some children get to a level which is acceptable, but others reach a level which is a cost to society, a cost to the judicial system, the health system, to themselves. And what we're saying is, if we really looked at how we would build on early years and what sort of experiences children need, and what from that would need to be assessed and examined that would be useful going forward, we might both fit the needs of children better, but we might also fit the needs of society, in that, you know, employers these days are realizing that the old-fashioned mantra for schooling, which is, you know, leave with a certain amount of GCSEs in England, or, you know, A-levels and higher in Scotland, that sort of logic is going now. Employers are much more context-free in the way they're thinking about employment. They're not just taking exam results as a proxy for being a decent all-round educated person. So we're trying to open that debate up through our proposal for a curriculum for childhood and a curriculum for adolescence, two separate imagined processes.
And this is great, because what we've got is we've got a commitment to depoliticize education, which I think is something that will chime with a whole number of people, particularly under such an ideological government as we currently have. And the idea of building a curriculum forward from the child rather than backwards from the exams. So two really powerful starting points. And what I'm now looking forward to is hearing what the other four foundation stones are. Well, this has been brilliant. We've had our two big ideas already. We've got four more to come. What's foundation stone number 3?
Well, the third one is, you all know about the Open University, and many people in Scotland will have taken advantage of the Open University. And when I went in the middle of my career to a university to run an education department, I discovered that the Open University tutors, all in universities across the United Kingdom, they were shamelessly taking the materials that have been developed by the Open University and were making sure that the materials used in undergraduate courses within those British universities was much better. They certainly were much better in places where there was a tutor on the academic staff who had been with them. Now, we think, just as a child, it depends so much what your teacher is. You know, the classic tale of the kid who says, oh, I love geography, and then 2 months later they say they hate geography. Well, why is that? Well, I don't like Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so. And it's down to the teacher. We think that we ought to extend what's possible for every child. So we're proposing an open school, but think of the Open University as the model. The open school would be making the best of virtual schooling, of online facilities, experiences and opportunities. So the open school would curate that, not in a repetitive way of what happens in school, but extending people's horizons, as well as enabling kids who've missed out to catch up. So in other words, in every secondary school in England, we hope there would be tutors for the open school, and that they would put their youngsters, where appropriate, in touch with what was available through the open school. The open school would be funded independent of government, so I hope they would drop a capital sum, rather as they did with the Education Endowment Fund in England, drop a capital sum and let the interest pay for the running of an independent open school, which would link with the Education Endowment Fund on the south of the border, the Chartered College of Teaching, and would therefore become not merely something for all kids, but it would be something that professionally helped teachers and extended their possibilities. So that is our third foundation stone.
And this is so important because what's come out in the recent OECD report on education in Scotland is just to underscore yet again the lack of consistency. People will talk about Scotland's performance in PISA, but they're talking about an average performance. They're not talking about the schools in Scotland which perform above that level, nor are we really talking about the ones that perform below that level. And it's that inconsistency in a sense, and I think anything that gives a parachute, if you like, that breaks the fall of children who finish up in a school that they wouldn't ideally want to be in, or with teachers that they wouldn't ideally want to be with, that's a really, really powerful idea and a hugely ambitious one. How about Foundation Stone 4?
Well, our next two, 4 and 5, are directly related to young people and what we can do to build on that notion of the open school and a more flexible approach to learning, and how we can help children to see their talents and capture their interests as we go through the school system. So we've got 2 programs, Foundation Stone 4 and 5. The first program is a universal provision for children in what we call year 6 and year 9. And the second program would be for children from the period from year 5 to year 9, but 20% of those pupils annually being included over the 5 years. The first program we called Seeking Talent and Extending Participation Scheme, which spells STEPS. And that occurs at 2 times. First in year 5, when it would be first steps, and second in year 9, when it would be next steps. And the principle of that is each pupil would, with support, design and manage an extended individual project, which would take a day a week for at least 20 weeks. And the outcome would be a presentation by the pupil of what they had learned using multimedia approaches, including presenting to an assessor. And the project would be expected to focus upon the world of work, or the function of democracy, or health, or the structure of communities, or the natural world, and would seek to identify talent for the children wherever it lay in terms of their ability to enjoy exploring some aspect of the world around them. And the audiences for the presentation would need to be authentic, and so we would rely on local businesses and employers and councils and public sector agencies, providing opportunity for people to take part and contribute positively. And we'd use the sort of approach used by the Scouts and Guides Association, which has got this notion of sort of assessing against clear objectives in their proficiency arrangement. And our idea would be that each pupil would be supported, perhaps through their school and wider through the open school, so that we could help them to create the best project that they'd done in our STEPS program. And we'd support the children by giving them a budget of 250, say at today's prices, for year 5 and year 6, and 750 when they got to year 9, so that they'd got money to spend, to think about, to learn, to manage in terms of their projects, to take them places, to meet people, to buy books, to organise resources and so on. A second example of a project aimed at children is called the Extraordinary Learners with Exceptional Creative Talent Programme, which, if you work it out, spells elect as opposed to select. And we want our children to elect to take themselves into rich experience across a broad spectrum of activity. And this links directly to that notion of capturing talent. We think schools should consider the widest experiences for their children, but children still realise that the dominant purpose of schooling is exams, and we want youngsters to explore their talents in a much more creative way. So the notion of the of the elect program is to basically look for, in whatever way, the Shakespeares, the Michelangelos, the Beethovens, the Berners-Lees or the Mandelas, but also the female examples, the Hepworths, the Curies, the MacArthurs, the Austins, the Fitzgeralds, Dupreys, Gilberts or Sharmans. And we say, well, you know, if children can see themselves as people at the cusp of developing their talent, they'll see that those people, what we would call autodidacts, the people with amazing resilience, self-motivation, single-mindedness. And we want the children to follow that through their chosen field. So we're saying each year group, each cohort, let's find 20% that would be just at the right moment to catch because they're showing an interest, showing an enthusiasm, and let's feed off that interest and help them to develop. And so it's not every child every year, and it's not selecting children. Every child gets a go, but at different points when they're ready in terms of maturation, so that none of them are allowed to slip through our fingers and sort of miss the opportunity. And we built on the work of Matthew Syed in his work Bounce, where his theory that every child has talent. What they need is a coach, and need an opportunity, and they need somebody to create the right context. And if they do that, then they get that chance to walk a few steps in the sense of with genius, so that they can see what it feels like and take it on from there. Now, we think these programs are not the same as the gifted and talented programs of years ago, but they're a chance to move on from that and take children into different domains. So the elect program and then the steps programs are ones that we propose as foundation stones.
What you're talking about all the time in this is the idea of enrichment. So what you're talking about is having a provision beyond the school that all children can access, a kind of a creative Oak Academy, if you like, a benign Oak Academy that will do more than simply force catch up, but will actually allow children to go attend a virtual institution, to learn there, to explore ideas. The other thing which I think you're doing superbly with these ideas is the sense of building on the interests of the child and building on the ambitions of the child. And that's so powerful, given what you said earlier, Mick, about trying to redesign education so it's built forward from the child rather than backwards from the assessment. So there's a real coming together around that. And the last point I think that you've really made with these foundation stones is around this idea of let's create an opportunity for children to do more. And I think often the accusation that we get around progressive ideas in education is that they're more associated with dumbing down, that they don't have the rigor, they don't have the ambition of that more traditional curriculum, that the sort of Eton model, if you like. And what you're talking about is giving young people the opportunity to challenge themselves. And that seems to me to go back in many respects to some of the things that you were doing when you worked in Birmingham, around the whole idea of children having entitlements to experience. You seem to have maintained that. So experience, enrichment, and ethics, I think, are all part of that. And I love this concept of creativity. Are these really important ideas for you in terms of this overall set of stepping stones, if you like?
Yeah, they are. You've summarised very well what we hope will flow from what we're suggesting. And we think the key to that, David and Suzanne, is I think we do, Mick, we're back to the teacher again, where, you know, we said at the beginning about the Junot quote, and that they make the weather and the climate. And we focused a lot on our last foundation stone is establishing an expert consultant teacher role. So the teacher, not the teacher who wants to go into management, as in effect, that's what you and Mick and I have done, but the teacher who delights in pedagogy and becomes expert in pedagogy and wants to keep a career in pedagogy. So we are suggesting that every school or partnership of schools, we think it's a ratio Mick always tells me I get this wrong, but it's a ratio of Mick 1 to 50.
120.
You mean sod. You're a
Close.
mean sod.
Close,
Mick. Actually, I bet you
I
that
know,
gets
I know.
edited. Anyway, the ratio is, what we're saying is it doesn't mean every teacher. It means a teacher who's been teaching for 5, 6, 7 years is always kind of intellectually curious, is trying new things out, is acknowledged by others as the teacher who has amazing skill in pedagogy, and becomes the coach and the consultant and a key figure in the school. We played around with something rather like that south of the border with advanced skills teachers some time ago. And I think you've done something similar in Scotland at various points. We think that needs to be taken really seriously, and those people need to get a reward that, for instance, in the medical profession, is being beyond the GP, it's being the consultant. And we think a consultant teacher is desperately needed if we're going to enable teachers together to take the system forward and unlock the minds and the hearts of all children, not simply some of the children. And so our last foundation stone is that proposal.
Well, if I could just come back on, David, what you were saying about enrichment, I absolutely agree with, and I applaud the efforts teachers and schools make to enrich children's experience. My feeling as a sort of teacher who never grew up was that learning should always be enriching, and that once you start creating some learning as enrichment, it implies that the other learning is something else. It's leaden or pedestrian or hard work. Hard work should be enriching. I believe scholarly activity is as important as practical or creative or imaginative activity, and that we should be enabling children to see that there's a joy in all those pieces of human endeavour. And then in the sense that Tim was talking about encouraging teachers to take that professional route, which is about pedagogy. I've been somebody who's held various roles and always thought that teaching and curriculum was central to all the work you do. And I know Tim has always felt that too. And, you know, I know lots and lots of people who felt that. But actually, the school system gives lots of messages about if you're an early career teacher, the image is that you're to do well in the career, you need to move away from children and their work and what they're doing, their play, their enjoyment, their close work, and that's different from other professions. In other professions, as you elevate through the profession, you move closer, in many cases, to the subject that you're dealing with. So in medicine, you as you become a specialist or a consultant, you get called in to do the hard cases. You know, the top consultant comes in to do the big heart operation, and other doctors, other specialists gather around to see that happen. And we don't have that same image in teaching. In teaching, you know, the top people, the heads of schools or the heads of whatever, are the people making big decisions on behalf of the others, not being close to the person that they're trying to help. If you're in a law firm and you're head of the law firm, you get brought in to deal with the hard cases, supported by the rest of your team. Whereas, you know, if you're the child with really quite significant special needs, often you get a lower qualified person, hardworking but lower qualified, to help you. So I think our consideration of the expert consultant teacher is about valuing the commitment to the individual child, the child with challenges, whatever those challenges are, even their massive talents, and trying to coagulate all the professional quality around making a difference for children. And so our 6 foundation stones come together in that respect around really high quality school communities.
Can I come in there and use a strong statement to give us something to push against? I hear you talking ultimately about values, about how we value children, how we value teachers, and how we value relationships. We haven't used that word here, but I think that's a key part of what you're talking about. A teacher who's effective makes relationships that feel safe and enriching for children. So let me ask a strong question. Why aren't those our values already? How did this system that you've just described, that you think doesn't serve children and indeed doesn't serve the teachers in it either, how did we come up with an education system that is founded on values that don't work for the human beings in the system?
I think that's a very easy thing to answer, which is, and our book addresses it, that in all those years, nobody has bothered to set out the purposes of the schooling system. I know that sounds extraordinary, but they haven't, apart from introducing people to the best of what is known through the curriculum. We repair that, so the book's worth reading, and we won't illustrate it now because we haven't the time, but it's worth reading simply for setting out our purposes and values. And those purposes and values are closely related to a healthy society. And if we want a healthy society that's capable of dealing with climate change and pandemics and the social media and all the many problems we've got, we need an educated population, and we need our schooling system to achieve far more than it's achieved in the past. And that's what we've set out. We set out a path, a number of paths that will lead and converge in a better society. So we've handled things like, Suzanne, and I know you're concerned about this, we've handled how do you make schools as communities better places? How do you value the many staff within schools that aren't teachers, but contribute nevertheless to the climate that youngsters experience? So we've done those things, and we hope that those who read it will particularly secretaries of state, will agree that they perhaps have too much power and have not given quite enough thought to how they can optimize all the efforts of the people within the system.
We also believe that across much of the world, there's a broad consensus of hopes for our young people, what people would like youngsters to see as their future. You know, we'd want them to be competent and confident, so that as humans, they're able to cope in a range of circumstances. They've got a spirit within them, whether that's a faith spirit or simply a spirit that drives them forward. We'd want them to be intrigued by the natural world, fascinated by the way humans have tried over centuries and millennia to make the world a better place, and had enormous successes and had massive failures. We'd want children to enjoy the culture, the arts, the sort of the broader sporting achievements of each other. We'd want them to understand the difference in orientation or cultural background or whatever in each other, and realise that the world's got to live together. And we'd want them to be wanting to learn as they left the school system, and where appropriate, qualified for what they want to do in the future. But there's a broad consensus about that. And then because the system has developed over time from beginnings, several centuries ago, what we've got is a series of contradictions where sometimes we're playing out a contradiction to the very hopes we want to achieve. And that's why we've established what we think are the sorts of things that people ought to lay down as what our schools are for. And if our schools are for that, then everybody who works in them, whatever job they take, is somebody who can make a difference to a child's life, whether they're a school secretary or work on dining or site, whether they work in the classroom. They're somebody who can make a difference to the way the child sees themselves, the attitudes, the values, the relationships that exist in that school. And my career in teaching has taught me that the schools that achieve most for children are the ones that get the best ethos, culture, climate working in the school, focused on learning, but most of all focused on children and people.
Unless every child has a worthwhile relationship with at least one adult, doesn't have to be a teacher, They're not really at school. They might be physically there. They're not there. We want to make sure that everybody's there and taking advantage.
And I love the bold brilliance of what you're saying. And I know there'll be lots of people who might think this is overambitious, or it's airy-fairy, or it lacks practicality. But what you seem to have managed to do, I think, very powerfully, Mick, you've said, but it's happening elsewhere. Why can't it happen in England? We've got a sense of purpose in education in other parts of the United Kingdom. Why can't we have it here? And I think the other thing that you've done very powerfully, Tim, is to set out for us with some clarity what the alternatives are if we don't make the kind of cultural change that we're talking about making here. Because the problems are there. They're climate change, they're conflict, it's racism, it's intolerance, it's all of these things. And one of the things you've done terribly around this is offer the idea of a healthy society, one at home with nature, one where young people can learn who they are and be comfortable with themselves. But what you've added to it, I think, is that powerful sense of ambition. And my only regret about this is we've managed to cover the 6 foundation stones. I wasn't even confident we would manage that. We haven't managed to cover the 39 steps. And we haven't managed to ask the final question, which I think is what you would want teachers listening to the programme to do with your ideas. But I think you've answered that already. What you want them to do is to recognise their importance, to demand the trust to which they're entitled, and to continually develop the talent, insight and expertise that they would need, and that might someday take them to be that expert consultant teacher who can make the difference, not only for their colleagues, but fundamentally, as both of you keep saying, for the children. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you for being with us. It's certainly a big idea, and I hope that our listeners will go away inspired by the thinking that you've both done. Finish that book.
Thank you.
If you would like to explore today's big ideas further, you'll need to keep an eye out for announcements, because we're really ahead of the game with this episode. The new book by Tim Brighouse and Mick Waters will be published by Crown House sometime in 2022. In between, you can find out more from either of them in lots of earlier publications. Mick Waters' much-loved 2012 handbook on secondary curriculum design is available from Bloomsbury Publishing, and Tim Brighouse has 22 books to choose from. One of my favorites is his 2008 book from Routledge, The Joy of Teaching. There are lots of other podcasts and video interviews available with them on the web. We'll be posting details of these recommendations on our own websites too. That's SuzanneZeedyk.com and realdavidcameron.net. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon.
This has been the Ideas Hour, brought to you by Suzanne Zeedyk and the real David Cameron.